Welcome to this module on landlord responsibilities. We're going to look today at some of the responsibilities that you have as a landlord when you're tenanting properties. So we're going to have an overview of some of those responsibilities and some of the legal requirements, as well as just some of the responsible things that you should do when you're renting out your properties to tenants generally. We're going to look at the tenancy agreements and what you need to do to comply around that. We'll not cover every single legal requirement, but just an overview of that. We'll look at some of the deposit schemes and your requirement to comply with those and the different types of schemes that you can put your deposits towards. So let's start off by just looking at the property itself and considering what it is that you need to provide. You're required as a landlord to provide fresh water, space, which is adequate for someone to live in, heat, and ventilation. So what are some of the things that you need to consider within that? You need to consider some of the elements of hazards, whether that be in relation to dampness or perhaps mould. You need to consider perhaps where there's excess cold, whether you're providing sufficient enough heating. So the ventilation and heating around a property is really important. Now obviously your tenant has a responsibility to ensure that they properly ventilate the property when they're in it. However, you need to ensure that there is the opportunity for them to do it. So windows need to be able to open, or you need to have ventilation in the brickwork or in the, let's say, the bathroom, for example, to ensure that mould and dampness don't build up in areas and that the property can actually be well ventilated as well as have sufficient heating, certainly in the colder weather. When it comes to space, it's important that you provide sufficient space so that it isn't overcrowding, that there's a space that's safe for them to live in, so that if they're, let's say, have a room, that it can be a lockable room so that people can't just come into their space. They have the ability to have a safe environment to live in. We also need to look at you being able to provide them with fresh water, and that's not just fresh water, but fresh area for them to provide food and free from infection, basically. And so it's about the facilities that you provide within the property too, and also the hazards that can be around the property, and some of that might be trip hazards. Is it safe from trip hazards? Are all the carpets being fitted properly, or do they curl up in some of the corners and make it unsafe for somebody to be potentially wandering around potential trip hazards? Do you have handrails on the stairways, and do you have warning signs if there are particular areas where there is a hazard? If there's particular surfaces that are perhaps slippery, so if you've got tiled surfaces, have you done everything to try and make sure that they're not a hazard for someone to fall and have an accident? So those are the kind of things that you need to consider and look out for within the property when you're providing that to a tenant. If you're furnishing a property, then obviously there's an additional requirement that you need to consider, and that is that your furnishings need to meet the legislation, and therefore it needs to have some fire resistance to it. Now, usually fire resistant furnishings will come with a little tag that gives a clear indication that they comply with that legislation. And sometimes you'll find that the tenants will tear those tags off because they think they just get in the way. Well, you do actually need to make your tenants aware that it's important that they leave these tags in place, because that's what makes the furnishing compliant. And therefore, if they've torn that off, you can then suddenly find yourself, if that tenant moves out and you're moving other tenants in and you're using the same furniture, then it is potentially a situation where that furnishing, even although you know it's compliant, it may no longer meet the compliance regulations because the tag has been taken away. So just be mindful of that fact, and that needs to stay in place. And so just making sure really that you are keeping and maintaining a property to the right standards, keeping it legally compliant as well, is also important. And there are other legal matters that you need to consider. There are a variety of things that you might need to think about when you're renting out your property. The most common one legally is a gas safety certificate. Now obviously if you don't have gas at the property, then that might not be a requirement that you need to meet. But if you've got gas at the property, whether that's just gas heating, or you might have a gas fire, or perhaps even a gas cooker, then you have a requirement to ensure that you have a gas safety certificate. Gas safety certificates usually last for 1 year, and you need to provide the tenant with a copy of that certificate when they move in. And that is a requirement you need to do. It doesn't mean to say that you need to get a new one each time a new tenant moves in. If you've still got a valid certificate that still has some time left on it within its 12 months, then that is completely okay, and you can provide them with a copy of that certificate. And you have to get it renewed when the year runs out. So the next thing you need to consider is the electrical safety. Now, electrical safety is not a legal obligation, particularly in single-let properties where you may be just renting to a family. Then there's no particular legal requirement currently for you to check the electrics. Although I would say it's good practice for you to do so, for you to make sure that it meets at least a general safety element to ensure that your tenants are safe. The other thing that you will do is make sure that you provide evidence to your insurance company. If something were to happen with the electrics, then you can at least confirm that you've had them checked and you've made sure that you've done everything you can as a landlord to comply. Now, if you furnish a property and you put electric goods into it, portable goods, maybe a fridge or a freezer or a microwave, cooker, that sort of thing, then there's something called PAT testing that you need to meet. And that's a portable appliance testing. And you need to make sure that you comply with those regulations where you're having regular checks done on those portable appliances. If the portable appliances belong to the tenants, then there's no requirement for them to have them checked. It's only if you supply those to the tenants. Particularly, let's say, in houses of multiple occupation, where very often you have a room share environment and you will have supplied all of the goods perhaps in the kitchen, for example, where you might have supplied the fridge, freezer and the kettle and the toaster and the microwave. And therefore you need to make sure that your PAT testing is done on a regular basis to comply with the legislation. So the other thing that you need to consider, and this is more common again in houses of multiple occupation, is your fire safety requirements and responsibilities as a landlord. Now, in a single-let property, there's not necessarily any particular legal requirements for you to necessarily meet, but it's important that you ensure that the property is as safe as possible. So if you can have it checked, maybe by a fire officer, or install good fire safety measures, smoke detection, whether that's hardwired or battery smoke detection, then it's important that you supply those. In a house of multiple occupation, there is a legal requirement. It's not just a recommendation, it's a legal requirement for you to meet that in a licensed HMO. And there are various elements within the regulations that will tell you the standard that you need to go to within, let's say, each floor or the common parts, maybe the shared kitchen, shared lounge, and also if you've got your boiler in a particular area, that very often needs to have a smoke detection or fire safety measure around that. So it's important that you understand what your responsibilities are as a landlord, and you can find out more information depending on what type of property you're supplying. Will depend on what level you need to go, whether it's a recommendation or whether it's something that you legally need to comply with. So in the electrical side and in the fire safety side, certainly the legal requirements are there's much more onus on it if you're doing a house of multiple occupation and shared accommodation. And there's less requirement and responsibility and more recommendation when you're actually doing just a single let or a family let on one tenancy agreement to the tenants in that case. When it comes to an energy performance certificate, there is a requirement for you to have one of those in place, and that's before you even market it. you must get it ordered and get it in place before you market it, so that you can make your tenants aware of the energy performance within that property. And the energy performance certificate will last for 10 years. So if you've just bought a property, then you can look up, there is a website that will allow you to go and find an energy performance certificate. If it's already had one, you don't need to go and do another one. Unless there's some improvements being made, then you could potentially just use that same energy performance certificate. And that is on EPC Register. So you just go online to the EPC Register and you'll need the address of the property, and you'll be able to get a copy of the energy performance certificate, because they're all registered when an energy performance certificate is done. And there is a fine if you don't have one in place, so it's really important that you do it. It's not that expensive to do. It'll only cost you a few quid to put it in place, but there is a fine if you don't. And it's really important that you pay attention to the energy rating, because there are some changes in the legislation around energy rating. And so it's really important that you understand what your property needs to meet in terms of its energy requirements. And there are lots of support mechanisms for you to improve the energy performance of your property. So even if you're not paying the bills, it's important to pay attention, because you're still responsible for the property and you're providing a property of either low or medium or high rating in terms of its energy performance. And if it's low, then it will start to become a requirement for you to comply, to bring it up to a better standard. And therefore, that's why you as a landlord need to pay attention to what your minimum requirements are. And you should always try and provide a property that doesn't cost a lot to keep it warm and keep the energy rating in a good place, so that you're not burning energy and letting it go out to the open air. Now, when it comes to tenancy agreements, the tenancy agreement that is most commonly used, and certainly for a lot of people, they will put in place potentially some finance on a property, maybe a mortgage or something. And so therefore there are some requirements under the regulations of the mortgage company for you to meet what they want you to put in place in terms of a tenancy. And that tenancy agreement is an assured short hold tenancy agreement. And so you need to understand what it is that you need to put in your assured short hold tenancy to make sure that you are complying with the regulations. Now, most people would say it has to be a 6-month tenancy. That's not necessarily the case. There is a requirement in different ways for you to meet the tenancy agreement rules, but it's usually a minimum of 1 day as an assured short hold tenancy, and normally you can't take repossession for less than 6 months, so you do normally have to give them 6 months to live in the property, unless of course there are some issues where perhaps they haven't paid the rent, and there are things that you can do to try and get them out of the property before that. And if you've got a mortgage, you need to make sure that you comply with that. So if you try and if you were going to do an assured short hold tenancy and try and do it over 3 or 4 years, you have to be mindful that that may not comply with your mortgage rules. So you need to make sure that you understand some of the rules around the tenancy agreement. They're not overcomplicated, but it's just getting the fundamentals right. And you can get tenancy agreements drawn up through different mechanisms. You can use things like the National Landlords Association, who we'll talk about in a little bit, or the Regional Landlords Association, where you can quite easily join, and there's lots of support around that for different forms of paperwork and different things that you can use them for. Equally, you might use a letting agent to help you put together the tenancy agreement, but still it's your responsibility to ensure that that tenancy agreement is correct and it does actually comply with any requirement that you have under the mortgage rules, as well as it meeting the AST requirements. So in terms of the actual tenancy, it should be in writing. However, if for whatever reason there is no written agreement, then a verbal agreement will still be assumed to be an AST. So don't think that just because you have decided not to issue a written one, and there are some rules that you need to put in place to make sure you do supply a written one. So you could be liable to a fine potentially if you don't supply correct tenancy agreements. However, if you only have a verbal agreement, that will still be assumed in the eyes of the court to be an assured short-hold tenancy. However, if you don't have one, then that gives the tenant much more ability to have their say if there is a problem, and therefore you might find it more and more difficult to get a tenant out that's maybe not your best tenant or perhaps not paying your rent. It will just be more difficult for yourself if you haven't put something in writing. The other thing about an AST is that you will find that it can go periodic. So let's say you've put a 6-month tenancy in place, and then it goes from that contractual 6-month period to a rolling, let's say, monthly period. That's what's called a periodic tenancy. So if you decide to put a periodic tenancy in place, then you could end up with a periodic tenancy that runs on for years and years and years. And you need to make sure that that equally does comply with your mortgage rules, because a lot of the mortgage companies want you to keep up to date with giving fixed tenancies. They don't like it when tenants necessarily go on to rolling contracts that go on for years and years and years. And so make sure that you understand, if you own the property outright, then obviously it's down to your personal choice whether you go periodic and allow it to do that. But if you do have a mortgage in place, understand what the mortgage rules are around what you're required to do to meet those rules. And just know that it's important that if you have a letting agent in place, that you make sure that they comply, because ultimately you are still responsible for the property. So even although they're managing it on your behalf, if there's a problem, then you will be the one where the buck stops. Now, you may be able to take them to court or challenge them, but ultimately, if there is a problem, then it usually comes down to you as the landlord as being fully responsible. So don't just assume because you've put a management company in place that they're using the right kind of tenancies. I know a lot of people that have used management companies and they haven't paid any attention to what they're doing, and they haven't checked, they haven't got a copy of the tenancy agreement, and they don't actually know whether the letting agent or the managing company is complying with regulations or not. It's really important that you don't just sit back, take the money, pay the mortgage and take your money, your profit. You do need to understand that you are actually complying with the regulations, because you are ultimately responsible for that property and the tenancy agreements and everything around it. So please make sure that if you use a management company, get them to supply you with copies of everything. Get them to supply you with copies of the tenancy agreement, get them to supply you with copies of the fact that they've lodged deposits when we come on to that, get them to supply you copies of the gas safety certificate to make sure that everything complies. And hold yourself up to being accountable. It is your investment, so please make sure that you look after it. When it comes to actually serving notice to tenants, the tenancy agreement will normally require clear month's notice from the tenancy date. And that means that the tenant would normally be required to give you 1 month's notice, and that is from the date of the tenancy. So let's say the date of the tenancy starts on the 10th of the month, and the tenant decides to give you notice on the 12th of the month. Now, depending on how you've written your tenancy agreement, but normally the tenancy agreement would require them to give you a month from the date of the tenancy agreement. So it would be from the 10th of the following month. So just check that that is how your tenancy agreement is worded, and make sure that the tenant complies with that. You, however, if you need to get the tenant out, or you want to serve notice on the tenant for whatever reason, it could be that it's coming to the end of the tenancy and you want the property back, then that's fine. you do need to make sure it does come to the end of the fixed period. So let's say you have a tenant in there for 2 or 3 months and you have a 6-month tenancy with them, you won't be able to get them out before that 6 months because that is the term of their tenancy. And you may have some requirement to do that if they haven't paid you any rent, and therefore you might serve them a different section notice to try and get them out prior to that. But ultimately, in the main, you are required to allow them to have that fixed period, and then you supply them with 2 months notice. So let's say you wanted them out at the end of the 6-month tenancy, you would be required to give them 2 clear months notice from the date that the tenancy started. And that is the requirement. So if you missed the start of the tenancy date, again, if you were going to serve them notice, if they started their tenancy on the 10th of the month and you wanted to serve them notice, you really need to give them notice 3 or 4 days prior to the 10th of the month, and it's 2 clear months. So you can't serve the notice on the 10th and send it to them and say that that's given them 2 clear months, because they could quite rightly in court argue that they didn't get 2 clear months because they didn't receive the notice until after the date had passed of the start of the tenancy. So please make sure that you give them sufficient enough notice. If you're not sure, take some advice. Rely on people like the Regional Landlords Association or the National Landlords Association if you don't have a letting agent in place, or perhaps if your letting agent is not providing you with accurate advice, then use someone else to get that support. And make sure that you're compliant with the relevant regulation. So serving a Section 21 or a Section 8, there are different Section 21s that can be served. It's not just one standard notice. You need to understand what type of notice you're actually serving within the Section 21. It's not overly complicated. It just requires you to take a close look at what's happening, get some advice and support, and make sure that you serve the correct notice. Because if you don't serve the correct notice and you don't serve it in the correct way, then you'll have to start all over again. Because the tenants are usually very aware of what they're allowed to have, particularly if it's a tenant that you're trying to get out. They usually have, they're quite savvy about the information and what they should get in terms of notice. And therefore, if you haven't complied, they are quite rightly able to stay in the property. And you will then need to take them to court, and if you have to wait then for a court date, and you get to the court hearing and they discover that you didn't serve the notice correctly, you will have to start all over again to serve them the correct notice. So it's really worth your while to take appropriate support and advice when you're about to serve your tenant's notice if you do actually want to get them out of the property. If you're going to go to the property, so when the property the tenant is in the property, I would encourage you to make sure that you conduct regular checks on your property. Keep an eye on the property and make sure that they're keeping it in the way that you want them to. However, you do need to write to them and advise them in advance of any visits that you're planning to do. So you may write to them and you tell them that you want to come and see the property and conduct a check of the property, and they might say, well, actually I'm not available on that day, can you come on a different day? And you do need to try and work with them to come on a different day. One thing that you can do, however, is you could suggest to them that if they're not able to be there, that you will go into the property, do your check and then leave. It's a very good idea for the tenant to be there. It's better because if there are any problems, you can discuss that and highlight that to them when they're actually at the property. However, you do find it difficult to get a tenant to actually arrange a date with you. Sometimes you do get tenants who will avoid doing the checks for whatever reason, and you need to make sure that you follow up on those because they might be doing something at the property that they're not supposed to do, and therefore they don't want you coming to the property. It could be that they maybe aren't paying the rent or there's a problem and you're trying to get to see them. So if you arrange a visit and they keep cancelling, then you might want to say, well, you know, on this occasion, we've tried on a number of occasions to organise a visit to the property. However, it doesn't appear that we're able to do that when you're available. So therefore, if you're not able to do this date, we're just giving you pre-advance notice that we will have to enter the property to do the relevant checks. And it might be that those checks involve you having to make sure that the gas is done, and that you're making sure that the property is still legally compliant in a way that you need to meet your responsibilities. So that's the best way to make sure that you are entering the property to ensure that you are maintaining that legal compliance. So do your regular checks. When you get there, I would encourage you to take a note of, what's good, what's bad, what do you need to give feedback to the tenant on. And if you're somebody who has your properties managed by an agent, then you should be in a position where the agent's actually keeping you informed of the position in the same way. So they're providing feedback to the tenant, but they're also providing feedback to you as a landlord to make sure that you understand how well your property is being looked after and what the tenants are, how they're keeping it, what the tenants are doing that might not be keeping it so well. And so really, really important that you go along and you take a record of your visit. You provide some feedback to the tenant of what's good, what you're happy with, and anything that you're not so happy with, so that they can have an opportunity to put that right. I would follow that up in writing so that you make sure that, again, it's written down. Or what you can do is, if you've got a little form that you get them to sign that form at the end of your visit, you might create a little standard template that is your property checklist. And you might just check each room, and it might be, you're going to check the carpets, or the floor coverings, you check the walls and the electric sockets and switches, and you check the ceiling and the lights and anything else that might be on the ceiling, like a fan or anything like that. So you can do a quick check of each area and make sure that it meets the required standard and they're maintaining it well. There are going to be, however, some occasions where actually it's just about you maintaining the property in good order. So there might be things like the fences need painting. Now that's not the tenant's fault that those need maintaining. That's something that is just general wear and tear. And therefore it's most likely going to be you that's going to have to do that. There are some tenants who are great tenants and they'll take care of it as if it's their own home, and they'll do these things for you. They'll maintain the property in good order. They'll paint the fences, and they'll check with you if it's okay for them to do it generally. And sometimes you might be in a position where you're happy for them to do it. Sometimes you may prefer to do it yourself to make sure it's done to the proper standard, that it's perhaps done in the colour you want it. And it's the same for the internal of the property as well. Some tenants are really keen to paint the property. Just be mindful that if they're going to paint the property and you don't supply the paintwork, then or the paint or the painter, then you've got two potential issues. One is that they may not do a particularly good job and you may have to repaint it when they move out, if they decide to move out. Equally, they may use colours that you're not particularly keen on, or other tenants are not particularly keen on, and that might require you to make sure you paint it again if they move out very soon after. So one of the things that we do is we get sometimes tenants who move into the property, and within a month of moving in, they'll say, we'd like to paint, this room and make it a different colour, for example. And what I like to do is I like to see tenants in my properties for about 6 months. So I usually suggest them, let's see how you get on for the first 6 months, and if you settle in and you're happy to stay, then I'm very happy for us to look at painting the room a different colour. However, what I don't want is I don't want a tenant that's going to move in, start painting the house, and then 6 months later they move out and I've got to repaint it all. So just make sure that you consider the consequences if the tenant moves in and starts doing things to the property. Sometimes you think, well, that's great, they're going to make it a bit better, but actually sometimes their paintwork isn't so handy. So just be mindful of that when you are actually allowing tenants to do work around your property. One of the things that you need to do is make sure that you remind the tenants of their responsibilities, and this is particularly key during the cold spells. You've got to make sure that they keep heating on low, and particularly over times where, like at Christmas time, if they decide that they're going to go away for a break and it's the depths of winter and they decide to switch the heating off to save money, and they come back and the house is flooded. Guess who they're going to call because the house is flooded? Okay, and then you're going to get into dispute about why the house is flooded and the fact that the pipes are burst because they switched the heating off. So one of the things that is really good for you to do is just at the winter time, or just before the festive season, you might want to send them a little note just reminding them that, to keep the heating on low and make sure that they're keeping the property warm and free from potential risk of freezing pipes, especially if they're going away at that particular time of year. But just generally reminding them of their responsibilities around maintaining the property, and also just looking after certain things around the property and keeping it free from hazards, keeping it clean, keeping it tidy, and keeping on top of it. And one particular one that's really critical with tenants, because we get a lot of this with tenants, is when it comes to particularly winter, but you do get it sometimes very occasionally in summer, where the property has a lot of condensation in it, and tenants think it's dampness because it's like a sort of a black mold type thing on the walls, and it's usually condensation. It's condensation building up because there's not enough ventilation happening in the property, where the tenants have all the windows closed and they have all the vents closed because they don't want cold air to get in. But what happens is that the warm air is circulating around the property, and when it hits a cold wall, let's say it's a cold external wall, then the two clash together and the condensation and mould build up over a period of weeks and months. And the tenant thinks it's dampness when actually it's not, it's just the property's not being well ventilated. Now, there are occasions where it might be dampness, but it's important that you educate your tenant around potential condensation and mould and what they need to do to keep the property well ventilated, particularly in the winter when they've got the heating on high and they've got all the windows closed. And if you've got vents in there, sometimes they'll cover over the vents because they think it's letting in cold air. There's a good reason why it's letting in cold air, and you need to remind them of why that is and their responsibility to leave those vents free so that the air can circulate around the property and you don't get problems with condensation. When tenants move out, it's important that you look at doing a check on the property before the tenant leaves. Let them know what work you expect them to do to meet the standard of how they checked in. So the likelihood is, and I would encourage you to do this, we haven't talked about this in this module, but when you check a tenant in, really important that you take a standard inventory, either a written inventory or a video inventory, so that you can check that the property is in a particular condition when they move into the property. What you want to do is you want to pull that out when they're about to move out. I would encourage you not to wait until the last day of the tenancy. If you wait until the last day of the tenancy, it's going to be very difficult for them to put anything right, and they might complain if it's going to come off of their deposit, because it means that they could have put it right for a much lesser cost if they'd just known. So one of the things that I would encourage you to do is to, if they serve you notice, so let's say they're going to serve you a month's notice, I would encourage you to, a couple of weeks later, maybe 2 weeks before they're due to move out, go and arrange the visit and arrange the viewing. Tell them what you're doing it for, to say that you want to come and do a pre-checkout so that you can check what the condition of the property is versus what it was like when they first got the property, when they first moved in. And just say to them that you would prefer that they're there, but obviously if they're not, then I would still encourage you to do the visit and do the check. And you can then let them know, is it just that they need to do some cleaning to tidy the property up, or are there some additional repairs that they need to do? Make sure that they're aware that these are the things that you need to do before you move out. Now, it could be that they leave some of the things when they move out and they're quite happy for it to come off their deposit. But you need to understand, is it going to cost more than the deposit? So you may want to make sure that you've done those checks, you've made them aware what you expect them to do to put it right. And you might even want to go back again, maybe the week later, to make sure that they're starting to make some inroads to it, particularly if the deposit isn't going to cover all of the work that needs doing. But as a minimum, you want to do a final check on the last day. So as they're moving out and they're going to come back either the day after or when they've finished on that day, you're going to go and meet them at the property and do a final check. And I would encourage you to have a written piece of paper so that you've got a way of you agreeing out any outstanding issues. You want to have things written down so that you can agree what it was before they moved in, what it's like now, and if there's any issues that are outstanding. You might even estimate the cost, or you just say that you're going to get costings done for that, and they will be responsible for paying for that work to be done. When you're doing the pre-checkout, obviously you need to make them aware of the fact that what you're doing is a checkout based on what you can see. So that might mean that there are other things that come up when they move their furniture. So like if there's maybe tearing the carpet, or there's a spillage that they've covered over with a sofa or something else that you weren't able to see until the last day, until they'd actually moved all of their furniture. So do that final check, and I'd suggest you agree out any outstanding issues, get them to sign the paperwork, make sure that they agree that that is the way that the property should have been left. And that way, when there are potential disputes afterwards, once they've moved on, if there is any potential disputes, that you've got a signed piece of paper that says these were the issues and this was what was going to be done about it, and they've signed that agreement to say that they were happy with that at the time. If you try and get that signed later, or you try and get them to agree to something once they've moved out, you'll find it much, much more difficult. So I really encourage you to make sure that as you get the keys from them, that you get them to sign that piece of paper so that you have an agreement about what needs doing and what doesn't need doing. So that brings us on to the deposit, and because the checkout really is the point where you will potentially use some of that deposit to put anything right that isn't correct in the first place. However, there is a legal requirement for you to secure a deposit, and there's a time frame in which you need to secure that with. Now, there are a couple of different registered deposit schemes. I've just put a couple of them here, where there's a deposit protection service. There's also the tenancy deposit scheme, better known as the TDS and the DPS. So the DPS, the deposit protection scheme, and the TDS is the tenancy deposit scheme. And there are other registered schemes. There'll no doubt be more over time, but those are the two main ones as they are at the moment. And they do offer some slightly different things, but in the main there are two different types of deposit schemes. There's an insured scheme or a custodial scheme, and there is a requirement for you to provide the tenant with information on the deposit scheme that you're going to use, and make sure that they've got the relevant information around that and the way that their deposit is secured. So what are the different types of deposit schemes? The insured scheme is one where you will insure that deposit rather than put the deposit completely into a custodial account. So you can retain all of the deposit by paying an insurance premium to retain it. Now, there are some benefits to that. That means that you've got the deposit in your hands, and you hold that until such time as the tenant leaves and you agree what's going to happen with that deposit on departure, and you can then give it back to them or give them a sum of it back. With the custodial scheme, that money is held in someone else's account. It's held in basically a government-backed type bank facility where the money is just held. You don't earn any interest on it. The money just sits there until it needs to be released. Now, there's some benefits to that. That means that, you know, obviously that money's put away. You're not going to touch it. You can't get access to it until such time as you and the tenant agree for the monies to be released and that money comes out. So there are some downsides as well to both of those schemes. The downside, I guess, of the insured scheme is that you might end up spending some of the deposits, and that might not work for you. So it really depends on how good you are at managing your money. So you might run out of money if you have to give the tenant their deposit back and you haven't got it if you spent it. So that's perhaps a downside there. The downside of perhaps a custodial scheme is that you do have to be able to agree with the tenant in order to get your money back. So it won't be released from the deposit scheme until either the tenant agrees or for some reason that it's gone to dispute and you've been able to resolve it in that way. And that can take a lot longer. So it really depends on which way you want to hold your deposits. Some people prefer not holding all the money and putting it away into a deposit scheme that will just hold the money and it will be released as and when. And some people prefer to have complete control over it and just insure it, pay a sum of money to insure it, and then hold that money so they've got more control over the amount of money that goes back to the tenant. And then if it comes to a dispute, for example, so let's say that you and the tenant don't agree how much money should go back to them, then there is a dispute resolution service that can be used. Now, if you've got the deposit money, if you've used an insured scheme, then that's much more driven by the tenant to be able to dispute that because they want the money back from you. If you've put it in a custodial scheme, there's almost more onus on you as the holder, if you like, of the deposit to prove that you should get it back, because the tenant can say that, you know, they're not going to give it back to you and this is the reason why, and then it would go through a dispute resolution, so you wouldn't be able to get your hands on it. And some of the challenges of that are, let's say the tenant doesn't leave your property in particularly good condition, or let's say that the tenant walks away and doesn't even tell you they're leaving. They go AWOL, absent without leave, and they just decide to leave the property, and you've got the deposit saved in a custodial scheme where the money's sitting, but the tenant's disappeared and you don't know how to get this money back. You've got a double whammy there. You've got money that you can't get your hands on until such time as you've gone through the relevant forms and information and provided the information and it's been released from the deposit scheme. And you've also got to put the property right to get it re-tenanted. So that can be a real downside of the custodial scheme. And the insured scheme obviously does have a cost to it, whereas the custodial scheme doesn't. However, you do have the money there, so if the tenant does go and leave you with a problem, then you've got that money there that you can at least use some of that or all of that to put the property right and get it tenanted as quickly as possible. So there are ups and downs of both schemes, but one of the important things is that you understand that you have to use a scheme. It is a legal requirement. And there are certain things that you need to do around that. You do need to make sure that you provide the prescribed information to the tenant so that they have full information and disclosure about how their deposit is held, where it's held, and the information around it. So those are some of the things around deposit schemes that you need to be aware of. Look into them. They're really easy to register for. It's free to register with a deposit scheme. So I would encourage you to have a little look at that, maybe register and get yourself set up to use one of the schemes. Certainly the Deposit Protection Service, they provide both services, both the insured and the custodial, so you can have a little look, register with them, and just, you know, you don't have to decide if you've not got a property at the moment, you don't have to decide exactly which scheme you want to use right now, but you might want to read up on it and just find out a little bit more information about that. Some of the support mechanisms that are out there to help you whilst you're becoming a landlord, or even when you are a landlord, really important that you tap into the support around you. There's lots of different landlord forums. The councils have landlord forums that can help you. We've mentioned the National Landlords Association and the Regional Landlords Association already, so that, you know, there are lots of support networks there that you can tap into. And certainly the NLA, as they're known, and the RLA have support groups where they have meetings, and they also have online facilities where there are different forums and a library of information that can help you as a landlord to make sure that you've got all the information that you need at your disposal. They've also got certainly the National Landlords Association, I know do. I'm not so sure about the Regional Landlords Association. The National Landlords Association has a helpline. So if you get stuck, if you're a member, you can call up, and it's not expensive to become an annual member of these groups. You can call up and you can get some help and support and answer your question by a live human being. So that's always a really good way to get some of the support you need. Because sometimes it can be a little bit difficult and you're not always that sure of which way you should go with a particular issue. It will most likely be something that someone's come across before, and therefore either other landlords, if you've got a local support group, you might be able to get their help, or using one of the bigger national or regional associations. There's also a company called Landlord Action. They're particularly good for things like if you have evictions, or you need to support with getting a tenant out or taking a tenant to court for arrears, that type of thing. Like I said earlier, it's really important that you get all the paperwork right. And if you aren't sure what to do, then it's really key that you get the right support and help to make sure that you deliver things in the right way. Or if you need help chasing up a tenant that's gone missing and maybe owe you lots of money, it might be that you want somebody to help you pursue those. And Landlord Action are really good. They're very much a company that know what they're doing, and therefore, you know, although they're not a national body as such, they're definitely a company that I would suggest that are at the forefront of supporting landlords when it comes to some of those challenging issues that you can have with tenants. So encourage you to use the support mechanisms around you, whether that's locally or nationally, to make sure that you're managing your properties, managing your tenants, and handling them in the right way to keep you as legally compliant and making sure that you are making the best of your investments. You're making the profit that you want and you're keeping them compliant at the same time. That's the best way to be. So what are some of the actions that I'd like you to take from this module so that you make a step forward? Because realistically, there's no good having this information unless you're actually going to take action and going to move yourself forward. So the first thing that I want you to think about is, if you haven't already done so, create yourself an example tenancy agreement. Use one of the landlords associations to help you if you haven't got one or access to one. If you've got a letting agent and you have got a property already but you've not looked at the tenancy agreement, get a copy of the one that they're using. Look at it and find out if it does actually comply with the legislation, and it makes sure that you are complying with what you need to do and meet as a landlord. I'd encourage you to register with a tenancy deposit scheme and make sure that you understand what tenancy deposit schemes are about. Getting registered and reading up on some of this information ahead of time will ensure that when you start to tenant your properties, that you have the answers. You're able to tell the tenants about the tenancy deposit schemes, and you're able to tell them what their requirement is to comply with it and what information they need. And it will just put you in a much more informed place. Look and see if the properties that you're looking at have an EPC. So if you've got a property already and you didn't have an EPC, go and have a look on EPC Register online. Have a look and see if there is already an existing one. If there isn't, make sure that you go and get one. If you're looking at some properties and you're thinking about buying one and considering those properties as a potential investment opportunity, go and have a look on the EPC Register to find out how efficient they are from an energy performance point of view. So see how your properties perform before you go and buy them. Check and make sure they're not at the bottom of the radar when it comes to energy, because you will need to improve it. The legislation is changing and you will be required to provide better energy performing properties. So make sure that you create some awareness around what those requirements are, and that when you're buying property, it's a consideration for you as you go forward. And I'll speak to you again in another Property Mentor module.